Welcome back to Discovery Debrief. We're now here into episode 3. I am co-host Chris Clow, and I am joined by Rachael Clow.
Hello.
Cicero Holmes.
Free all rippers.
And Zaki Hasan.
Good evening.
Excellent. So, wow, what a week that we have had, especially over the last couple of days on this show. But as I think we will do as a custom, why don't we begin with what our week in Trek was like for everyone else? So, Rachael, you actually started the audiobook that I talked about last week, Star Trek Discovery Desperate Hours. What are your first impressions?
I like non-emotionally scarred Michael Burnham. Like, she's kind of happy. She's kind of like has banter with Saru. It's nice.
All right. Yeah. It's definitely a new kind of perspective on her, just because it's kind of weird. That book is kind of weird just because it's going kind of deep into the character without a whole lot of appearances for us to fall back on as far as who she is, but definitely gives more context, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Zaki, the invariable question of whether or not you continued your broadcast order rewatch with your kids. I think this is just going to have to be a regular thing. Did you keep it going?
I'm very disappointed. I was all queued up and ready to go, and then, of course, life gets in the way. My boys had Boy Scout stuff on both days, so we had to put a pin in it until next week. Curses!
Oh, well, that's all right. I mean, that's a laudable thing for your children to be involved in, I think.
Well, the nice thing about the Boy Scouts is it teaches very Starfleet-esque morals and values. So,
right,
that's no bad thing.
Well, what is next on the docket for that?
It is. I think I glanced at my thing. It's Deep Space Nine, the episode Paradise from season 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So how are they enjoying Deep Space Nine in comparison with Next Gen?
You know what's interesting is they definitely like Next Generation more. Mm-hmm. And so it's when I feel like what I'm doing as a dad is I know I'm paying it forward because I know years from now they will have the appreciation of Deep Space Nine. So right now it's like when we have a Deep Space episode, like they don't hate it. They're not like, oh, but whenever it's Next Generation, they're like, oh, all right. Mm-hmm. So there's a higher enthusiasm for Next Generation. So I know that. And then I'm curious what happens once we make this, once Voyager gets introduced into the mix, if the equilibrium shifts in the direction of Deep Space Nine, or if they're like ship show, like that's their thing.
Sure.
I'm basically doing like a sociological experiment on these kids.
Sounds like another worthy goal to add to the list.
As a good
Cicero, how has Star Trek looked for you over the last week? Anything of note? Anything that you've done a dive into?
So you know what I did do a dive into was the Orville. So okay. I had skipped by the time we recorded last week. I hadn't watched the previously aired episode of the Orville. I think they're up to episode 4 as well. I am all caught up, and I would say that the Orville is more Star Trek than Discovery.
Oh, provocative thought. Well, interestingly enough, Rachael and I also caught up on that show, and we noticed that the most recent episode was directed by none other than Jonathan Frakes. That is correct. So there's certainly a Trek, a detectable Trek DNA that's going on in that show on multiple levels. But interestingly enough, I think that's going to be something that we talk about a little bit, just in a second here. But as for me, I'm mostly listening still to Desperate Hours. I didn't get through it as much as I wanted to, but I also did a little bit of a reread of one of my favorite Star Trek Expanded Universe books, which is Tales of the Dominion War, which is a collection of short stories that touch on what pretty much every other major Star Trek character of note was up to during that time. It gives service to what the Enterprise E was doing. It gives service even to the surviving original series crew members that had made it into the 24th century. And, I'm not as much of a hater of Star Trek Nemesis as some other people are, but one of the things that definitely piqued my interest when that movie came out was that Shinzon was basically a brilliant tactician in the Dominion War. leading a bunch of Riemann shock troops, and there's a story for that in that book as well. So I took a little bit of interest. I think Shinzon is one of the lesser issues of that movie overall, but maybe that's something we'll have to get into at some point down the road, because I know that movie tends to engender a lot of strong feelings in people, to say the least. But why don't we move on quickly to a couple of news items, one of which I want to get you guys' reaction to. So, last week, CBS made a pretty consequential announcement regarding Star Trek Discovery. They put out a press release that laid out how the rest of the season would be progressing. So, originally they had described the season as releasing in 2 what they called chapters, with 8 episodes in the first chapter running until November, and the final 7 running after the start of the new year. But now they have extended the first chapter to include 9 episodes. So we're going to be with you in 2017 through the last episode of the year airs on November 12th. So you'll probably have the last Star Trek Discovery main episode on November 14th. And then the remaining 6 episodes are going to finish out next year sometime. And alongside that announcement, they released the titles for next week's episode and the week following. Next week's is going to be called Choose Your Pain, and the following week's is going to be called Letha? Is that how you pronounce it?
The guy on YouTube pronounced it Letha.
Letha. Okay, it's Greek. It's classical Greek, and it means concealment, forgetfulness, or oblivion. But, so, I mean, that stuff is all well and good, but if you occupy any segment of the Geek Circle, then you probably know that this past week was the New York Comic-Con. And, of course, Star Trek had a presence at the New York Comic-Con, and specifically at a Discovery panel. They had a surprise guest in the form of Michelle Yeoh, which was cool, who came up in a mask, and she asked a question, and then she revealed herself, and not even the cast or the crew that was on the dais seemed to know that she was there, which was pretty awesome. But the thing that I thought was of note that I wanted to run with you guys, which kind of goes to Cicero's observation about the Orville. So at the panel, writer and producer Akiva Goldsman, who we talked about last week as well in reference to Spock, took it upon himself to answer a question about whether or not Discovery was fairly characterized as darker Star Trek. And he replied with a categorical no. No real caveats on top of that, but he explained himself. He said, quote, "The truth is, what we've been talking about tonight when we talk about Star Trek is the characters, which is actually relatively different than what you would talk about in previous Star Treks. To some degree, that would be different for DS9. Discovery is a wholly serialized narrative. In that narrative, we get to tell character stories over plot, which does not suggest that we don't have plot. If Jim Kirk had to deal with Edith Keeler's death in The City on the Edge of Forever as if it were real life, it would take a whole series or season, and we can stretch those emotions out for a season on our show. Our story is the origin of the feeling that is the original series. That's why we are 10 years before TOS. But we don't start there. We get there. The name of the show is Discovery not by accident. It's the story of how these people discover who they are. In long-form storytelling, you get the gift of getting to start somewhere. We're layered, complex, dark, and light because the best Star Trek is always all of those things." So, and you guys are obviously as big, if not bigger, fans of the franchise than we are, but the perennial debate, which was inevitably going to come up about whether or not Discovery is true Star Trek, seems to have arrived in the form of a vocal minority of fans. So in truth, we all knew that this was going to happen, and given Goldsman's quote, your own understandings of the Trek franchise and what we've seen thus far from Discovery, what do you think? Zaki?
On some level, I'm tired of this conversation because it feels like if not Discovery, we ask it about the Abrams movies. If not them, we ask it about Enterprise. And you know what I mean? Going all the way back to Next Generation, that same conversation. And so, my view of this is very simple. It's very pragmatic, and it is this: Star Trek is what the owners of the franchise put the name Star Trek on. It's as simple as that. And we can either accept it or not. But to me, Star Trek, the franchise, is like ice cream. And each iteration is a flavor. So you can say, hey, I love cookies and cream, but I'm not a fan of mint chocolate chip. Well, mint chocolate chip is still ice cream, whether you like it or not. and that's, so maybe, maybe Voyager is mint chocolate chip. All right, cool. If you don't like, some people my wife loves mint chocolate chip. I do not. That's Star Trek.
Well said. Cicero.
Honestly, I don't think I could have said it any better myself. Star Trek is whatever's in the Star Trek universe. Obviously, there is a sense that I kind of share, that there is a kind of an understanding of what or an expectation of what Star Trek is, and Star Trek as a television show is very procedural. But this Star Trek Discovery is completely serialized. And that is why the Orville feels more like Star Trek than Discovery does, in so much that it's a procedural. But it's not Star Trek, it's the Orville. And Star Trek Discovery is Star Trek. So, and that is definitely going to be a thing where the annals of history tell different stories about things within the moment. Then tell different stories than you would tell in the moment. And I think that 10, 15 years from now, when the story of Discovery is all said and done, and we have the context of the entire series, as well as some time to kind of digest it and really reflect on it, I think that people will look back on it fondly. Because I think it's a very, very good, and it's a quality show.
The Orville.
Sure. No, Discovery.
Oh,
Discovery. Yeah, I know it's so weird. So the Orville is what it is. It is a love letter. It is a love letter to fans of TNG, with a very sophomoric humor bent to it. But the themes within those procedural episodes are very, very TNG, very, very Star Trek-y. In fact, the latest episode was their quote unquote Q episode. But I think that it is what it is, and that's fine for what it is. But if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of what Star Trek is, and this iteration of Star Trek, and it is, I wouldn't call it Rocky Road. Maybe Cherries Garcia from Ben and Jerry's.
There you go.
That's what Star Trek Discovery is. And it is that, but it is still ice cream, and Star Trek is ice cream. That's the title of this episode.
Sure. There you go. Star Trek is
and I never really thought about the format, like as far as procedural or serialized, actually lending to the Star Trek feel. But Rachel looks like she's ready to jump in the ring here. What do you have to say about this?
I wish the internet was owned in 1987, so we could have some sort of record of just what general people were saying about TNG then, because I would be willing to bet money that they were like, this isn't Star Trek, this doesn't seem like Star Trek.
Do you think geeky fans would be upset about something new that came out?
What? look at the letters pages of like Starlog magazine and stuff. It was an analog flame war.
Yes.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was asking Chris how I could get my hands on some of that, because I think it would be interesting. All I could really find was like a New York Times article that called it really boring, but I mean.
Well, and I mean, to be fair, Encounter at Farpoint isn't exactly the best example of what heights the next generation will achieve.
Yeah, I just think nostalgia is such a powerful force in your determination of whether you like something in the moment, and something new is just never ever going to quite compare to what came before, because you've developed this love for it. And that might be why the Orville sometimes feels more like Star Trek, because it leans so heavily on nostalgia to TNG, down to the like uncomfortable gender plots that they both have. So yeah.
Well, I can certainly attest to the power of nostalgia. Just in my former occupation as a comic book retailer, I mean, our store was one of the oldest comic book stores probably in the country. It started in 1982, and it's still in business today. So we always had, some of our older clientele who have been reading literally since the 60s, when Marvel first started to change the face of how the comic book medium looked and the kinds of stories you could tell with those characters. I mean, we had people from the 60s generation of readers, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, all the way up through my own. And I would often get people, like when the New 52 at DC, their big Universal reboot from the 2011 came out, we had people who said, "Oh, Crisis on Infinite Earths did this so much better."
Right.
Or even one reader who said The Flash of Two Worlds was the only really good exploitation of the multiverse, and that was the first one. So nostalgia is definitely a powerful force. Just even as a comic book reader, I like stuff from 10 years ago more than I do now, but I also recognize that it's catering to a bit of a different audience. So very good points all around. I think that's always going to be good fodder for conversation. But why don't we move on to talking about this latest episode, The Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry. So, before we actually dive into the specifics of the episode, Cicero, why don't you start us off with just your brief first impressions of what you think of when you think of Star Trek Discovery Episode 4?
I think my first impressions overall with the episode is we've gained new insights about the main characters, both on the Starfleet side and the Klingon side, not all of which have been good for me.
Okay. Excellent. Zaki?
Initial impression, I like that we got more heavily into the narrative of the show. My overall impression was, number one, I like that the main subplot, I guess you'd call it, vis-a-vis Michael Burnham and this creature, felt very classically Trek-ish. Right. And I'm assuming we'll get into that in a little bit. I also really liked seeing Captain Lorca in command of the ship, and I thought he had a command style that was very different, unique. And one thought I had was, in our last episode, I remember comparing him somewhat to Captain Jellicoe, which is either a good comparison or a bad comparison. But at one point, he's like, "Get it done," which is like, that's Jellicoe's catchphrase, as opposed to the more genteel "make it so," and I that jumped out at me.
Sure. Rachel?
I really started to feel that we're getting into more of an overarching theme of the exploration versus military nature of the Discovery's mission. Mm-hmm. So you asked us about that last week, and whether you thought that was going to be an ongoing theme, and now I'm pretty sure that it is.
They're laying the dolly track, as it were,
yes,
in that direction. Yeah, and my just general first impressions are that this might be my favorite one so far. So I'm going to be interested to see over the course of this conversation where we line up and where we diverge on some of the specifics. So let's start off with I guess the subplot with the Klingon segment specifically. So the albino Klingon, whom we know as Vok, he has control of T'Kuvma's followers. So this apparently more nationalistic and hyper-religious alliance of certain Klingons, he has basically been the heir apparent. And we pick up, it's about 6 months after the battle at the Binary Stars, and we see that those Klingons aren't in particularly good shape. They're hungry, their provisions are running low, and they are trying to get their ship operational again so they can contribute to the war effort with the Federation. But we see a wrench kind of thrown into the mix with a member, interestingly enough, especially from a canonical perspective, a member of the House of Kor, whose name is Call, played by actor Kenneth Mitchell. And he apparently shows up first as is kind of an extension of an olive branch between the other houses of the Klingon Empire and T'Kuvma's followers. but Call ends up undermining Vok's position of leadership and kind of steers his followers away because I guess when you're hungry, the idea of eating again is it's persuasive, generally speaking. But Zaki, I remember from the first episode that you had some issues with getting too deep into the weeds of Klingon world, I think is how you described it. So how did this stuff strike you in this episode?
That hasn't changed. At some point, I'm just hearing a bunch of guttural nonsense, and I know that that's like hugely offensive to like mega fans of the whole Klingon thing, which is cool. I respect that. But I think for dramatic narrative purposes, can we just have the conceit of hearing them speak English so that like this isn't as agonizing as it is? Because we're talking about a solid third of the episode is just guttural grunts.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Cicero, how about you?
So, if you guys remember from at least, I guess it was a couple of episodes ago, I was hoping that we'd get to hear about more of the conflict within and some of the motivations of the Klingon forces, right. Because right now they are just. Or at least at that point, they were just these, fanatical zealots. And I was hoping that in this episode that we would see less zealotry and more motivation. And that's not what we got. We got more zealotry. Like it's so. One of the things that you didn't talk about was Alex Kurtzman at the New York Comic-Con responding to a question about the primal savageness of the faces of the Klingons and how they looked very African and if that was very deliberate with these huge wide noses.
Oh, see, I didn't even know about this. Please enlighten us.
Oh yeah. So that was a question that was asked to Alex Kurtzman, and he responded with, there's, I won't go into it now, but there is an explanation as to why, the Klingons look the way that they do. We will get into it later on in the season. So, I mean, and that's fine. And I'm willing to give the showrunners grace on coming up with a narrative that makes sense and having an ideology that makes sense for these characters, for the antagonists. And as the episode goes on, we find that they started fractured, they came together under Takuvma, and now they're fractured again. But the one underlying point is that they're still kind of religious zealots, and it kind of it rings a little not hollow for me, but it's a little dangerous for me because you've got this people making the analog of the Klingons being Africans as one from one standpoint, and then if you listen to their motivations and you listen to the things that they have to say after you've read dozens and dozens of subtitles, because we're not fluent in Klingon, you can make the analog that these are they're akin to what Americans believe are Islamic radicals or Middle Eastern radicals, because of that same level of zealotry and just this belief that we've got to destroy the enemy with by all costs and not and keep ourselves pure and not be infected by their technology and that so that kind of disappointed me that's where we are right now. I was hoping that we would get something different, but I can kind of understand it, and like I said, I'm willing to give them grace to see where this goes and to see hopefully that there's some more nuance to who the Klingons are and what they're doing, whether it be from Vok the albino and his new paramour, or whether it be from the other houses. I'm hoping that there's more to the Klingons than what we have right now.
Sure, absolutely. Rachel?
I thought this part was, the Klingon stuff was just so slow, and I was just thinking about other things in it. Like, why don't they have hair? The Klingons have hair. And
They have beautiful hair.
yeah, wonderful hair and braids and all kinds of stuff. And then just, I don't know, just thinking about how are they going to explain how they look, and just getting bogged down in the details because not much is happening on screen.
Yeah, and you know, we watched the review of the last episode that was done by the awesome YouTube channel Trexpertise by Kyle O'Sullivan, and you know, he made a point in that review that I thought was well taken. The last time that Star Trek actually significantly changed the look of the Klingons, it had an effect on the canon, and it had a creative point that was really interesting to watch unfold. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens this time too, because they do look different. You can't really deny that, and if it's in the continuity.
Yeah, but on the other hand, that kind of set this precedent that they're gonna explain every time that they change the way that aliens look or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's just maybe you could just change them. And
right, and I can see the merit.
And it's just, it has me on the lookout for, how are they gonna explain this? And I wish I could just be kind of like, they changed it because they want to change it because they have good makeup now.
$8 million an episode, I would think so. But, you know, to Cicero's point about what Alex Kurtzman had to say, I mean, maybe there will be some kind of more creative story point that sees this sect of Klingon. Maybe it's an aristocracy, you know, maybe that's why they're more ornate than we're used to seeing them. Or maybe they'll just go with it. I mean, it could go either way.
That's kind of the problem with creating a show in the middle of a timeline of an established universe. Which is something that they still have to address overall with Discovery. The technology, the wardrobe, the Klingons being one of or three of the most glaring kind of dramatic changes from what we know the technology to be in this time period, and what we know people to look like in this time period versus how they look on this show. So,
yeah, sure. Well, I do want to move on to the next topic, but before I do, real fast, just want to call out to people who are listening to this, watch Blood Oath, the season 2 episode of Deep Space Nine, because it might have some interesting effects, particularly when it comes to the House of Kor and Vok. Maybe.
I'm almost there.
We'll have to talk about it in the future.
2 episodes away.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. So maybe by the next time, then we'll be ready. But either way, I think it definitely warrants a conversation. But let's get into the central conflict for Michael Burnham. Conflict or developing relationship. Michael is obviously brought on as a member of Discovery's crew in the science division to figure out what's going on with the creature that was recovered from the Glen. And initially, she's assigned to figure out how to weaponize it because it was so unstoppable on board that ship against Klingon soldiers. And it didn't really seem to have a scratch on it. Obviously, things took a little bit of a different direction. We lost Commander Ellen Landry, the chief security officer of the Discovery, which I was certainly surprised about. But so we learn more about the tardigrade. We learn more about this creature that has now become affectionately known as Ripper. So this appears to be kind of the most potent aim of this episode, is developing our perception of what Ripper exactly is in the context of the show at large. Rachel, how did this strike you? What are your thoughts on it?
So I really liked the way it was presented in the episode. So as a scientist, I feel like this plot kind of exemplified a thing that we sort of deal with which is the idea is to do research based on things that we're curious about versus to do research to achieve a specific short-term goal. And so Michael Burnham is given the short-term goal of weaponize this thing, but she's curious about it and she wants to learn just generally about it. And by learning just about it in general without specifically trying to weaponize it, she is able to figure out a really amazing new function for it. And something that's mentioned a lot in science is this speech that Donald Rumsfeld gave about terrorism, where he talks about, there are the things we know,
unknown knowns.
There's the known unknowns, so there's gaps in our knowledge that we know need to be filled, but then there's the unknown unknown, and there's there's the things that we don't know, and Ripper was his function was something that they didn't know that they didn't know.
Right.
And the only way that we can really find out what we don't know is by exploring our curiosity and just going wherever the research takes us. So that's kind of what I got out of it, which I think is probably not what everyone would get out of it. But.
Zaki, how about you with Ripper?
I think that there were a couple things that jumped out at me. I mean, I think number one, the creature is a vehicle for exactly the spirit of discovery, no pun intended, that the franchise should be about. So I appreciated that we through the presence of this creature, we got the sense of number one, the idea. It's a very Gene Roddenberry idea. The thing that we think is out to get us, maybe we just don't understand it. And and this is right out of that. And so I appreciated that it gave Burnham a chance to become Starfleet again.
Right.
That being said, I thought that the way it's like Burnham was the only one who had that inclination to be like, well, let's try to figure this out. That felt out of sorts to me. I think Commander Landry may be the dumbest Starfleet character I've ever seen, and I include like every red shirt I've ever seen,
Yeah. I mean, you could probably make a pretty reasonable case for looking or leaping before she looked, right? I mean, that's absolutely what happened. Cicero, how about you? You seem to have been impressed by Ripper.
I have been affected. Say. I am full Team Ripper. I'm wearing my hashtag Team Ripper t-shirt right now. The thing that really struck me more so than Ripper was the statement that Michael Burnham made, which was that, and I'm gonna butcher this, is that the alien is the alien, and it can only be what it is, and you can't put your expectations on it to define what it is. And that's a bad paraphrasing of the comment that she made, but again, not only was she talking about Ripper, but she was talking about herself, of course, and Chief Ellen, the dearly departed, was able to pick up on that right away. I will defend her, Ellen, just a little, prior to her grabbing the phaser and opening the cage, and in so much by saying that whether she was loyal to the captain to her death, and whether she agreed necessarily with all of the actions that he's taking to try and achieve his goal, she was 100% focused on helping him achieve his goal. And sure. In that case, she decided that it didn't matter what other type of scientific benefits Ripper could have. It was, the captain told me to weaponize it, so that's what we're going to do. And it's, it's kind of like if your parents tell you to rake the leaves, you rake the leaves, and if there's an anthill under the leaves when you're raking them, it doesn't matter. They just told you to rake those leaves. So, so you wind up with ants all over you. I really like Ripper. I'm very, very, very interested to find out where Michael Burnham's gonna, if she's going to wind up being not only the first mutineer but the second mutineer by doing something to save what I'm assuming is a species for which she shows some affinity, some level of empathy, whether they're friends per se is still kind of up in the air, but she definitely has some affection for the creature.
Yeah, sure. And, just from my perspective, this is when I really got, kind of like Zaki, I really got the traditional Trek vibes off of this. Because obviously, Star Trek as a franchise is built on the idea of using the knowledge at your disposal in order to try and find a better way, a way beyond what is typical, a way beyond violence. And this is definitely something that came very close to hitting a very regular Trek kind of vibe, and I'm glad to see that the show moved in that direction. I love Ripper too. I didn't think that I would think he was cuddly by the end of the episode. Are we sure it's even a he? We're just kind of...
I feel like they might not have he and she.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well, Ripper just in general... intelligent, maybe cute. I would not have thought that Ripper was cute, but Ripper's cute. Damn it!
Ripper.
So no, it was definitely a pretty interesting place for them to take. I guess a new character that was introduced in such a bloody and violent fashion on the show thus far. Yeah, and as far as Commander Landry is concerned, not too surprising, sort of like with Captain Georgiou, since we knew that she was going to be a guest star. I guess she probably wasn't going to be long for this world, but still a little surprising, just in the way that she was dispatched. I didn't really expect that to happen. But weirdly enough, through the death of Commander Landry, that's when we actually got our first look at another member of Discovery's senior staff, the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hugh Culber, who was played by actor Wilson Cruz. And obviously we don't have too much to go off of with this character, but he does seem to sort of fall in line with some of the other members of the ship's command crew in the sense that he has a sardonic sense of humor and seems like he comes from a little bit of a darker perspective. But did anybody get any other impressions from Dr. Culber?
I definitely got there was a little bit of sexual tension between him and Stanitz. Yeah.
Oh, did you? See, I didn't even...
Yeah, there are going to be a couple.
Yes.
They either are already or they are going to be, but that's part of that's baked into the cake, yeah.
I'm so bad at picking this stuff up. I
didn't get it either, Chris.
Well, still, I mean...
But then I barely remember this character, too. I think I was taking notes at the time, so...
Right, well, either way, I mean, so he's definitely going to have to be someone that we watch a little more closely. But, like I said,
we
haven't had
gay couple in Star Trek, or continuing gay couple, it's kind of a big deal.
Oh, it's absolutely very significant, and it just adds to what we talked about over the last couple of episodes with representation. I mean, it matters, and what better franchise to take it forward than Star Trek? So very cool to see. And I'll be interested to see the icy exterior of Stamets maybe melted a little bit by a significant other, just in general. I think that would give us a new perspective on what he brings to the table beyond.
Well, I really did like Stamets's his kind of line in the sand that he had drawn with the captain, regarding what they were trying to do with this technology. And the fact is that Discovery is built around the spore transwarp spore technology. I'm sure there's an official name for it and I'm just messing it up. But, the fact that he was like, hey man, we should be using this for discovery. We should be using this for exploration. We should be using this to better both man and, Starfleet kind, Federation kind. And Lorca was like, no, you're going to use it how I say to use it. This is a ship of war. We're at war. This is what we're doing. And
weirdly enough, he seems like he might be the most principled crew member that we've come across so far, even though he might be the coldest. But that invariably brings us to Captain Lorca, and I'll share my perspective real fast. The thing that immediately jumped out at me was at the end of the episode. I mean, obviously he has his aims. He wants to try and weaponize Ripper. He wants to try and get the spore drive up and running, and they have a very vested interest in getting to an embattled Federation colony that's under siege by Klingons. But the thing that really struck me for some reason, you barely ever see him sitting in the center seat. You know, he was standing up, and in the middle of the fight at the end of the episode with the 3 Klingon birds of prey, he was composing. Did you notice that? He was standing at the front of the bridge and he was moving his arms like he was a composer of war. And I thought that that was a really, really interesting take on him. But Captain Lorca obviously is getting a lot of different feelings from Star Trek fans. Zaki, how did Lorca strike you here?
You know, I gotta say, I'm liking what I see of him so far. And I make a distinction between liking and admiring because I don't know if I admire him yet. But I think as a character, he is so interesting. I don't think we've ever gotten certainly a Starfleet captain like this who ostensibly is one of our protagonists. We've gotten, nut bar Starfleet captains. But it's always filtered through the perspective of Jim Kirk or Captain Picard being like, no, don't be doing that, He is clearly doing, un-Starfleet things, but he's doing it in service of certainly what he would argue is the greater good. I mean, the moment when he pipes through the ship, the audio of the suffering on the colony, I thought that was so fascinating because it's like, what are they supposed to do about it? What is the crew supposed to do other than what they're already doing, right? So it's this extra level of like a guilt trip almost, And so I think he's fascinating. Like that's I don't know where I'll be on him when this novel that we're watching, when we reach the end of it. But for now, I mean, I want to see more of him. I want to see what's going to happen next to them. And I think that's certainly, when you're talking about a serialized show like this, that's a huge that's a win. I would put it as.
Yeah, emotional manipulation by piping through suffering on the entire PA system. That's certainly not something we've seen before. Right. Rachel.
Yeah, I definitely thought that was a interesting management technique.
Like cracking an invisible whip.
Yeah. I was really interested in Saru's little comment that he made to Michael when he was kind of throwing shade at her, but he was saying, he said something to the effect of, well, maybe you do fit in with Lorca, like that was a bad thing. So I think it's really interesting that Saru's the first officer, right? Yeah. And he doesn't seem to have a super high opinion of Lorca.
Doesn't seem that way.
Yeah,
no.
I thought it was interesting. But yeah, I too am very interested in him, and I think that there's a lot of really interesting acting choices being made that really add to the character.
Yeah, Jason Isaacs definitely gives him a transfixing kind of presence. Like whenever he's on the screen, you can't really take your eyes off him. Cicero?
Where last week we, I was talking about him being Captain Taxidermy, and he just really seemed like, he was heading full force into a heel turn, and you really get to understand, the nuance that I think is lacking in the Klingons, I think is in full force with Captain Lorca and the rest of the Discovery crew. I thought, man, this him catching what we now know as Ripper and taking a captive was going to be like this big secret that would take a few episodes to unfold. And before we even hit the open, he had shared his capture with Michael Burnham and put her in charge of figuring this thing out. So I was like, oh, well, okay. So he's not keeping it a secret, clearly. That's interesting. And then, of course, that the fact is that you think this guy is just a cold-hearted SOB, while he's arguing with Stamets and he's, trying to do all the things that he's doing, and he's just forcing them to use this technology that they're not ready to use. But then he pipes through that last transmission from the mining colony, and you realize that his job is, like he said, I'm good at war. And his job is to win this war. And he is going to do that at all costs, but there is a reason for it. It's, he's trying to save the Federation. He's trying to save humanity. He's trying to stop the Klingon threat. And that is probably more important, at least in his eyes, more important than you liking the things that he does or thinking that he's a good person.
And he doesn't give any, he certainly doesn't give any indications that he cares necessarily about what people think of him. Well, so we're getting near the end of our discussion points for the episode itself, but one thing I did want to briefly touch on, the deceptively emotional final part of the episode that we saw, the last will and testament of Captain Philippa Georgiou. I didn't cry. Why do you think that? No, I wasn't doing anything. Don't worry about it. Zaki, what do you think of her parting words to her protege, Michael Burnham?
Well, I mean, I think obviously it's very bittersweet because she's giving her this valediction under the assumption that she's talking to a captain, right? And that's the extra tragedy. But I mean, take care and take care of the ones you're supposed to take care of. I think that I'm screwing it up, but that's I have no doubt that's going to be something that plays out over the course of the season. But what occurred to me also is I was glad to get this sort of final image of Captain Georgiou to sort of wash away the earlier description of the Klingons eating her.
Yeah. Oh my
which
God.
I found horrifying. I'm actually surprised we didn't mention that earlier.
Yes, exactly.
Blocked it out.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they describe it in such detail. It's like, dude.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the end, not really that surprising necessarily, but definitely visceral and shocking. So, oh boy, Cicero, the last will and testament of Captain Georgiou.
Obviously, it was beautiful, and no, I did not shed any tears. I'm a man, damn it. But what it made me think about was just how much Michael Burnham's fate is tied to the death of Captain Georgiou. That had Captain Georgiou lived, or she had gotten her back to the Shenzhou before she could have taken her, before she took her last breath, I think she would have made a case for there not to be a court-martial of Michael Burnham, and she would have been the captain of some ship. I definitely think there's the potential there. And then, of course, her leaving Captain Georgiou leaving Michael Burnham, ostensibly her family's most prized possession, something that had been in her family for hundreds of years. And I think that the telescope is going to be an allegory for something going forward, looking into the stars or seeing beyond where you are right at that particular moment in time, and to see something far away.
Yeah, definitely a emotional moment for that last episode. So, and Captain Georgiou, she's such a cool character anyway, that it's hard not to want to see more of her in general. I mean, she's really cool. She's really cool in the book that Rachael and I are reading, so more of her would not be a bad thing. But one of the other questions that I had on here in relation to the episode, Cicero, why don't we start with you? What do you think the title is referring to?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely, it's a double entendre of sorts, because it, obviously the first thing that you think of is Ripper, that the butcher, of course, is Lorca, and he doesn't care that this animal is, or that this being is something other than what he wants it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And,
sure.
And, as far as he's concerned, it's a lamb. And whether or not it's the most intelligent lamb that has ever walked, in history, or whether it's the dumbest, is immaterial to him, is the fact that the lamb has sweet meat. That's all that he's worried about. I think that the other part of that is that, Burnham herself is a lamb who's crying, and Stamets is a lamb who's crying. And Lorca is still the butcher. If you listen to Saru when he is talking to, and their relationship, I can't get enough of just the layers of the relationship between Michael Burnham and Lieutenant Commander Saru. Their relationship is great. I mean, I could watch an hour of the two of them kind of going back and forth, and just how much Saru really cares for Burnham, despite how much it eats him up that he cares for her. So I think that's really unique, but Saru is basically saying that Lorca is the butcher, and to, to a certain extent, we're all lambs, because he's the one that dictates exactly what it is that we're going to do. And ultimately you're going to do what he wants you to do.
Yeah, definitely. Rachel?
Well, I kind of thought it might relate to how the Klingons were just slaughtering those people on that planet that they were going to go rescue. And that there's sort of a relationship between, those people being slaughtered and the abuse or the torture of Ripper to save them, and how you're sort of making this choice of who's going to be the lamb and who's going to be the butcher, and sort of replacing one group's suffering with another entity's suffering.
Yeah, sure. And interestingly enough, the planet that the Federation colony was on, Corvan 2, was in an episode of, or at least referred to in an episode of The Next Generation. And the environment was briefly described in that Next Gen episode, New Ground, and it looked a whole lot like what we saw in this latest episode of Discovery. So just another little point that they're paying attention to some of the longer standing continuity elements. They didn't need to use a planet that we've heard of before, but the fact that they decided to, I think, is pretty cool. It means that they're throwing fans like us a little bit of a bone when it comes to referencing canon. I think you guys might be both right about the title. I mean, the title itself, The Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry. Yeah, I mean, it could be referring to the Klingons. It could be referring to Lorca. Maybe it is actively referring to both of them. Because Lorca and the Klingons seem to share some unsaid tendencies as far as their predilections for war. And it's really unsettling to see. And I think that's where some of the doubters of this show overall are starting to get turned off, at least a little bit, by this emphasis on darkness and warfare. But, like we talked about at the top of the show with what Akiva Goldsman said, I mean, the original series is the end point for however long Discovery ends up being. But we are still seeing elements of the lineage of Star Trek, particularly as it related to Ripper and the scientific discovery surrounding Ripper that Michael found out about. So I would encourage fellow Star Trek fans, if you're thinking of maybe not going with Discovery, to keep with it, because I think we've seen just the beginning as far as how this fits into the larger cosmology of Star Trek overall. But another great conversation with our panel. Much appreciated to everybody. And we only have one brief element to get to with listener feedback this week. So let's open up the old communicator. So as you probably know, if you've been listening to the show, I have requested that people write some reviews to let us know how we're doing. And one listener actually availed himself of that request. He actually sent it in a Facebook message because it's a little critical, and he didn't think that I would probably be predisposed to reading it. But I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is long, and I appreciate the detail, but it comes from a listener named Max. And his criticism revolves around the level of detail that we go into as far as the episode content is concerned. He mentions listening to a Game of Thrones recap podcast. He he's not really in an economic situation where he can afford an HBO service on top of other streaming services. And now CBS is coming out and asking for more money for a specific streaming service for the network, which is the only way you can get new episodes of Discovery. So what he says is that in our title, obviously Discovery Debrief, the word debrief indicates a military level recapping of specific events. And this is what I was expecting. This is not a debrief, but rather a love-in. Don't get me wrong, I love love-ins, especially regarding Star Trek and Star Wars, but based on the second half of the podcast's title, I expected a debrief. Each act of each episode in detail. That's what should begin each episode, and then we can go as meta as we like. So he thinks that we need to do our job a little bit better because it will help give context to people who have not seen the show. So he gives us a rating of 3 stars at the end. That could easily pop up to 5, he says, with a show reformat. So, Max, again, thank you. We always appreciate anyone who's going to take the time to give us any constructive criticism. I open any criticism, especially if it's constructive, probably mostly if it's constructive, as my panelists can probably attest to for their own shows and their own endeavors. However, I do think that there is a bit of a response that I can give to you. And I mean, it's not like we are not open to providing a more in-depth recap, but there are a couple of inhibiting factors that I think keep us from doing that practically. And the first is our panel size. We have 4 people, 4 very knowledgeable Star Trek fans on this show who want to jump in at every possible opportunity in order to give as media perspective from longtime franchise fans as we can. So if we decided then to avail ourselves of your recommendation and go into really specific and exhaustive detail about the episode content, that would probably significantly inflate the size of a particular episode, which, it has a cost for potential listeners of the show. It has a cost for us. It has a cost for my hard drive space and for editing time. And we all have full-time jobs in addition to the fact that we love getting together every week to talk about Star Trek. So that's what kind of makes it a little unreasonable from our personal perspectives. And the second is the second part of our title. So the actual definition of the word debrief as a verb is to question someone, typically a soldier or spy, about a completed mission or undertaking. As a noun, it's a series of questions about a completed mission or undertaking. So in the analogy you bring up, we're actually not the soldiers on the mission that are recounting everything in a formal report. We're the cross-examiners that ask the questions of the mission as a whole for the people that have already experienced it. That's not to say that we don't have strong feelings about the affordability of yet another streaming service, which if you listen to the first episode, we certainly have. But we do go into a recording with the expectation that a listener has watched the latest episode and is looking for a supplemental experience from knowledgeable franchise fans. But I think that your point is a valid one, and we're certainly open to revisiting the format if more details wanted from listeners. So we'll have an internal conversation about that later. But if you're listening to this and feel similarly to Max, then please feel free to let us know however you can. But that being said, we appreciate your thoughtful submission, and we sincerely hope that you stick with us going forward. But if we're not for you, then there's certainly no hard feelings from us, because you're among friends.
Well said.
Cicero, what do you think? Do you think detail is something that that we should go into, or are you happy with the format as it stands?
Currently, I'm happy with the format as it stands. I think that everything that you said was spot on. That the expectation, at least from my perspective, is that the listeners are looking to us for supplemental information to kind of piggyback off of their viewing experience, and not as something to replace the viewing experience. I would personally recommend to Max that it's unfortunate that it is yet another cost for another streaming service, and that you don't have the ability to access it right away. But I'm not exactly sure what you can do with that, because if we did go over each and every act and agonizing detail, the show would be triple the time that it currently is, and that's not tenable.
Probably be like 3 hours long, right, Rachel?
And the CBS police would probably kick down
Right.
our door.
Right.
Well, and another recommendation too for people who are listening to this who are looking for a more in-depth recap. It's not immediate, of course, but a great Star Trek resource in general is Memory Alpha. It's an exhaustive Star Trek encyclopedia. If you're a big fan, I'm sure that you probably visit it every day like I do, in some respect or another. So, there are places where you can get that. If you were looking for us to provide that, I mean, we can certainly examine the idea of changing the format a little bit, but right now I think we're getting into a decent groove, and we'll just see how things go in the future. So again, thank you for writing, Max. But that's probably going to end up doing it for episode 3 of Discovery Debrief. We tried to run a little bit faster on this one because we don't want to inflate too much listening time, and that's why I saved the programming notes for the end. But like always, we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please like and follow us on our social media channels. If you'd be so kind, as you probably just heard, we'd like it if you wrote a review for the show, whether it's on iTunes or Facebook or Podbean or whatever you can find. It only takes a minute, and we'll be happy to read your review on the air when it's posted. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow the show on Twitter at DSC Debrief, where you can also find all of our individual Twitter handles. And feel free to send us questions through Twitter, our Facebook page, or by emailing us at hailingfrequencies@discoverydebrief.com. Please be sure to set your courses for this feed so you can come along with us next week. So, from Zaki, from Rachel, from Cicero, I'm Chris. Please come back next time, and until then, go boldly, my friends.